when we're talking about annual forage crops, I like to start us out actually by talking about perennials, because when we're thinking about that big picture, understanding how the role of annual forage crops has changed since the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, up until now, really can kind of bring into focus why this topic is so popular right now, why we're talking about annual forages so much more than we were, say, 10 years ago. So this graph shows an estimate of how many acres of hay were harvested in Ontario between 1981 and 2017. So as you can see, for a very long time, we're hovering around 2.5 million acres. And then around 2008, grain prices go way up, hay acres start to drop very, very quickly. So in recent years, we've lost quite a few hay acres. I'm actually really curious to see what the 2021 census says. I hope that's out in May. Usually they stick those out in May, to see whether this trend is continuing or if we're starting to stabilize there. But we've lost hay acres over that time. I've also graphed yield in our major field crops. So grain corn, soybeans, winter wheat, canola, and hay. This is the yield, the average yield each year in metric tons per hectare, just because then we're able to compare to hay. If we do it in bushels, it makes no sense. But looking at the actual yield, it's just a bunch of noise. It's really hard to see what's going on. So when I graph the trend line and just smooth out all of that noise, we can see pretty clearly that yields in grain corn and winter wheat have increased quite a bit. Yields in soybeans and canola are making steady improvements over time, but our hay yields have actually gone backwards. And there's probably several reasons at play for this. One that comes to mind is hay acres being pushed onto more and more marginal land. Some of it might be changes in how we manage the crop, or maybe changes in our understanding of how to manage the crop. Those might be factors at play. It's hard to know for sure because we don't have clear data on that end of things. But what we can see is that in general, the yield trend in hay is going the opposite direction of what we would like. So when we combine declining acres and declining yields, what we see is a big shift in the relationship between the supply of hay that we have and the demand in Ontario. So our supply is this green squiggly line. That's the tons of hay produced in the province. So factoring in that average yield and the acres from the previous two slides. The bars along the bottom, the light blue is cattle, so both dairy and beef together. The orange is sheep. You can see on either end I'm missing some data for each of those types of livestock, but the idea is to give us kind of a proxy for demand. It's not perfect. I don't have, for example, horses in here. We don't have good numbers on horses, but they eat a lot of hay. So this is not perfect numbers, but I think it does illustrate the point that while possibly demand has kind of declined a little bit over time, it hasn't changed to the same scale that the supply has. So basic economics, if you have a lot of something, it tends to be less expensive. When you have less of something, the price goes up. So I know that, Ben, you probably haven't been watching hay prices continuously since from when you were raising veal calves till your daughter got her cows, but there's been a big change in how much a round bale costs in that amount of time. And this is part of why. Some of it is input costs and some of it is the supply and demand. So I bring up this scenario as context because it does mean that the role of annual forages in the big picture has changed. So the old recommendations that we had were that using annuals for forage was a last resort. If the weather's awful and we're not going to have enough hay, then, chuck something in the ground quick and hope that we get some rain and it'll catch and you've got an emergency forage to bail you out. And the thinking behind that was just these annuals were too expensive compared to perennial hay to be competitive, right? You've got your seeding costs every year. You've got the fertility that they need. They're very hungry. You've still got your harvest costs. You're probably doing this in addition to your perennial hay. So it just didn't make economic sense when there was always surplus hay around and the price of hay was very low. Because that supply and demand has changed, because the value of hay on the market, if you're trying to buy, has come up so much, it's changed how we maybe should be thinking about annuals in our production systems. So they're still more expensive to grow per ton than a perennial crop, but they can help us manage those inventories better. Often they grow at times when our perennials maybe are not as productive. If we include them as part of our whole forage crop plan, either in rotation with forage crop or in rotation with grain crops, they can help fill some gaps there. And sometimes that peace of mind of knowing I've grown that on my farm and I've got it is worth whatever the price difference is between trying to go and buy hay on the open market, just knowing you've got some extra forage yourself through those annuals. So it's not necessarily a solution for everybody, but it is something that we're taking another look at because of how the economics have changed. So I really like this old drawing because it really captures how the growth rate of our perennial forage crops changes throughout the year. So in the spring, grasses and our cool season legumes, they are growing really, really fast. So that's that steep upward curve in the spring, May through June. Once we get to the summer solstice, grasses have all headed out. If we haven't managed to cut them before then, they've all headed out. They've basically kind of reached their biological goal. They've set seed, job done. Now we can just settle in for, keeping ourselves alive until next year. So because they've set seed, because it's starting to get hotter and drier, all of those things mean that growth rates tend to slow down in the summer. We get into what is sometimes called the summer slump. So growth rates slow right down or maybe stop. And that's throughout July, maybe August. And then as things get cooler, as we get more regular rainfall, usually growth rates pick back up again. Into September, October, those grasses are growing in the fall. We get some production there before everything shuts down for winter. So because our perennials are not producing even amounts of forage all throughout the year, I know the top says when is pasture lacking, we can use this not only for a grazed system, but also for our stored forage systems to figure out where can we find places to just boost that production. And the horizontal line on this is representing livestock demand on that farm. So you can see, times of year where we're growing way more forage than grazing livestock could keep up with, and times when it's not meeting that demand. And so managing that in some ways is easier with stored forage because we're storing it all at once and feeding it later, but just being aware that, there's times of year where we're going to have surplus and times where we're going to be short, and trying to figure out if we can find cropping options to fill those gaps. And that's, I think, where annual crops really start to shine. So this kind of builds on that last slide. At the top, we've got in our different colors sort of when our different types of crops grow. So this dark green here is that cool season perennials. So our alfalfa, our perennial grasses, red clover, crops like that, they're going to grow very much on that dark green curve. When we think about warm season grasses, so things like sorghum to Sudan grass, forage sorghum, pearl millet, those sorts of things, that's that really pale green. I know it's hard to see, but they grow super fast in the summer. So they're filling a niche there by being productive at a time of year where everything else is kind of taking it easy. Our winter cereals are fun because they tend to go even further into the shoulder seasons with their growth than our perennials do. So they're first green things up in the spring, even before the grass greens up. You'll see our winter cereals in the field, and then kind of the last green thing in the late fall, early winter. And then I've got this little sort of turquoise bump in the fall. That's some of our cover crops. So like our spring cereals, some brassicas, that kind of thing that we might get in after a wheat crop. They tend to be productive there, but they don't overwinter. The bottom half of this slide is more stuff to think about when a producer's coming up with a forage crop plan, sort of like the whole farm forage production plan. So I love to encourage people, get both the nutritionist and the agronomist involved. And I'm using those terms kind of loosely. Your nutritionist can be whoever helps you with your feed, and your agronomist can be whoever helps you with your crop inputs. But just getting knowledgeable people together to figure out how are you going to meet the animal nutritional demands, how is it going to fit in a cropping system, and just recognizing that different types of crops with different life cycles, whether it's grass or legume, and whether they're warm or cool season, they're going to grow differently. They're going to fill different gaps and have different strengths, both in terms of cropping and for rations.
Okay, so Christine, I think what the direction Christine's been going is kind of, I think you're making the case for annual forages and how they can be a fit within a crop rotation, and how, the reality from, 20, 30 years ago is quite different now in terms of the economics and the business case for these annuals. And I'm just going to build on that and talk about some of the soil and kind of broader cropping system benefits of annual forages. So just through a few photos on the left hand side there, you can see that's a view of the soil from, with in that case it's cereal rye, but any kind of winter cereal is going to give you that nice soil aggregation. And that's not only helping to, improve soil structure or tilth, it's also building organic matter. You've got roots that are releasing exudates that's happening, in the fall, and then in the spring again when it's growing. That root material really helps to contribute to stable organic matter over time. And you've also got this is something that cash crop growers who use cover crops will say, and I think there's no doubt about it. Having a winter cereal like this in the spring is going to give your equipment some good footing and improve trafficability on your soil. And that situation is gonna vary depending on what kind of spring conditions we get. But in situations where we get very, very wet spring conditions, that's where having this kind of annual forage, a winter cereal, can really be beneficial to help suck some moisture out of that profile, and also help get equipment on that field to get work done in a timely manner. It can also go the other way, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of drier weather. But that's definitely a benefit to keep in mind. And then the photo on the right is from research that's been done recently at the University of Guelph. Francois Tardif and Clarence Swanton, as well as Mike Cobra, our colleague, has been involved with this work. And you've probably heard of the impact of some of our winter cereals, and again, cereal rye in particular, on Canada fleabane, and how it can help to suppress fleabane. And in some cases, like the photo you're seeing here, really even completely outcompete it. And so that photo actually there is showing the allelopathic effect that rye can have. This is on a coarse textured soil, and it was incredibly effective in suppressing Canada fleabane. And in cases where the fleabane poked through that rye, which again, that's not a forage rate, that's a pretty light cover crop rate of rye there, but it helped suppress and keep those fleabane plants easier to manage through herbicides, even when they did manage to germinate in that environment. And I have personally seen that effect on a variety of farms across southwestern Ontario. It's a real good tool to add for managing resistant weeds. Here's another example. This is the traditional reason why we grow cover crops. A lot of livestock producers maybe take this for granted because they've got alfalfa or hay in rotation, and they're not seeing the same kind of erosion that their cash crop neighbors are. But there are weak spots depending, for dairy farmers with corn silage, that's pretty bare ground that goes into the winter. Even if it's not worked, it can be very vulnerable, especially if you've got soil that's prone to erosion. So this is just an example of the benefit that a cover crop had, again, a winter cereal. In this case, it was not being grown for feed, but it was grown thick enough that it could have been harvested for feed. On the right-hand side, you can see this was after a big rain event that happened in April. This photo on the left is showing the kind of soil movement by water that happened just across the road. And then on the right-hand side, again, that grower had his soil protected and covered with a winter cereal, and really saw very little soil movement. So those are the kind of the big ones in terms of soil and cropping system benefits that just kind of adds on to Christine's case for considering annual forages. Back to you, Christine.
Yeah. So, when we're talking about introducing some new forage crops to our inventory, everyone always asks, well, what's the quality like? And of course, the answer is it depends. But I do like to show a couple of slides with some basic quality information just to kind of give people an idea. I guess I'll ask, because neither of you have cattle at home. Are you guys interested in the quality stuff?
I am very much so.
Okay, we'll dive into this a little bit then. Um, Yeah, so this particular slide, I focused on some of our annual forages that have fairly high yield potential. So we'll start on this far right column. So again, I did this in metric because it was easiest to pull, but the interesting part is really the difference between them. So nothing touches corn for yield, apparently, unfortunately, fortunately, however you want to look at it. Corn is a very big subtropical grass, but we do have some options that can come close. So sorghum Sudan grass tends to produce really well in Ontario. This is a 2 or 3 cut crop. It's not a 1 cut crop, but we can get reasonably good quality feed out of it. Our warm season grasses are not as digestible as our cool season crops. So when I'm talking to dairy farmers, they're talking heifer feed, dry cow feed, if they're growing sorghum Sudan grass or pearl millet. It has a place in a beef cow ration, right? It's not rocket fuel, but it's got some good nutrition there, reasonable amounts of energy. When we're looking at our fall cereals, you know, they're a bit more digestible. The yield is maybe not quite as high, but we've got some interesting double crop options because, you know, we seed them in the late summer or early fall and we take them off first thing in the spring. So while, you know, they're not competing with corn on their own, we've got some opportunities to get another crop in there, and that can make them very appealing in a crop rotation situation. As Jake will tell you, I like talking about our annual ryegrasses. They're very fun as a forage crop, and we will dive into them a bit more, but they can be rocket fuel. The trick is getting production and persistence. They can be a little bit hit and miss because they like a really mild, temperate climate, and sometimes ours can be a little too extreme, but we can talk a bit more about that later. My next slide is even more of the quality data. So I broke some of this out. There's some crops on this that we're not necessarily going to touch on in detail tonight. But I put alfalfa and silage corn at the top just because they're so common in our livestock feeding systems and they pair so nicely together. Like there's a reason why they're kind of the two most common on a lot of dairy and beef farms is just, you know, alfalfa's got the protein because that's the thing that corn is bad at. But they both have good amounts of digestible fiber and total digestible nutrients, which those two are kind of the energy in the crop. And yield potential on both is very good. So when we're looking through this, I know tonight we're going to talk a fair bit about our cereals and our cereal pea mixes. The legumes tend to be really strong at protein. That's why I've got them bolded on this slide. So clovers and peas tend to have high protein. We'll get into why ryegrass is bolded. That's not a typo. When it comes to the energy, that's really where our grasses shine. So cereals are just annual grasses we've selected for seed production. So between the sugar content, the digestible fiber content, if we let them get mature enough, potentially the starch content. So that's really where this energy is coming from. And again, yield potential, we're looking at sorghum Sudan grass is fairly consistent. Italian ryegrass can be a bit more of a risk, but if you get the weather conditions and the management right, it can be a very high yielder as well. And some of these other things are not very far behind, like our winter cereals can also be a fairly high yielding crop.
Christine, just a question.
Yeah.
When it comes to, let's say, location, or do any of these shine particularly in a better place in Ontario? Because you always get the conversation. Like we've done a lot of ryegrass harvesting down Norfolk, Brant County, and I feel that would grow just as well up in Bruce County. But there's always this, oh, that doesn't grow up here, or you can't do that there. We don't have the heat units. What is there anything?
Not having heat actually will help the ryegrass.
Okay.
So ryegrass, it's overwintering that tends to be very hit and miss, and sometimes it just stops in the summer. It's too hot. But as long as you of dairy farmers in Huron and Perth that are growing it, I'm sure it's creeping up towards the Bruce. So yeah, nothing really jumps out at me as you can't grow it somewhere in Ontario. We do run into length of grazing season constraints when you get into northern Ontario. So very often, instead of a cover crop, I go, guys, you've already got this mastered. Like you grow a spring cereal, you harvest it, and then you summer seed your perennial hay crop. Like don't change. You've already got the cover crop benefit. Don't worry about a cover crop. You're fine. Yeah. So aside from that, I would say no. It's more just figuring out which crop best fits the niche you're trying to fill in terms of the cropping season, and then the specifics for the agronomy. And we're gonna touch on that tonight.
Christine, I'll just add one thing,
Yeah.
which is like for the like we're and it's more it kind of in my wheelhouse in terms of like the winter cereals and where might they be a better fit in the province. The further north you get, just the double crop option of going to corn or soybeans afterwards is going to become limiting, like just because it's going to take longer to reach the boot stage or whatever stage you're targeting harvesting, and then you're going to potentially run out of season. But much of very very common to be, at least to be harvesting rye and then going to corn or soybeans in like Wellington County, anywhere south of there. I don't know, Christine, how many people are doing that much further north, but
They're not, but this is why I'm so glad we tag team this, because I forget that people might want to grow a grain
crop
crop as
after,
their double
yes.
crop. Because in my head, it's like, well, obviously you do your winter cereal and then you go into sorghum sudan grass, so that will fit in that shorter season in more northerly locations. So this is why we're a good team, because he remembers some
especially
people want to
with,
grow a grain crop.
yeah, and especially those who are with crop prices the way they are, growers are wanting to be able to get as much yield out of that following crop as possible.
Well, and I thought it was interesting because we were baling silage rye like May basically down, and I mean if we can get it off at that time in Bruce County, I mean we still got lots of time to get a second crop, even if we wanted to put beans in or something. So I just thought it was interesting that you see it a lot down there, but doesn't really get too much further north. So
Yeah, if you were taking rilage off in, Algoma, Temiskaming, maybe Manitoulin might get away with it, but like they'd probably be going into a sorghum sudan grass because it'll be June by the time they can get in there and that rye's ready to go. So they wouldn't necessarily have space for a grain crop, but they would have space for a forage. All right, so when we talk about filling some of those niches and that, I like to ask producers, when do you need the feed? Because that sometimes answers the question of what annual forage should I be looking at. Now, the flip side as well is if you're just trying to fill gaps in your crop production, if you're looking at it and going, oh, I've got a window here, that can be the other or the other approach to look at this. But since I'm normally working with livestock producers, I say, when do you need the feed? So if they need the feed in the fall, so as something to get them through the winter, we're not really going to focus on grazing tonight unless you guys decide you really want to. But if you're trying to get something harvested before winter hits so you can feed it over the winter, then very often we're looking at something that will go in kind of after winter wheat and take advantage of that cool weather before things all freeze up. So things like spring cereals, potentially peas, some of those annual clovers, and brassicas all kind of fit into that niche really well. Brassicas, I don't have slides on tonight because they don't store well at all. If you try, especially in baleage, you're going to end up with a slimy, rotten mess. But even trying to get them in the silo, if they're too high of a percent of a mixture, they don't quite have enough sugar to ferment really nicely, and rotten brassicas stink like sulfur. So they're very unpleasant as a stored forage, but in the field as a grazing option, they can be a good fit. So we won't be touching on them tonight, but the other ones we've got a little bit more info on. So when we're talking about seeding those spring cereals after a cereal grain harvest, so probably winter wheat, but it could be something else. Generally in the fall, it takes between 60 to 70 days for oats, barley, or spring triticale to reach boot stage, which would be kind of our dairy quality forage. It's historically been unusual that those spring cereals would set seed in the fall. Like they'll still head out, but there's not a whole lot of grain fill going on, which from a forage perspective is nice because we don't have to worry about rumen acidosis. We don't have to worry about some of those other things if we were grazing the crop. The recipe that has come about by research, and Jake's gonna dive into how they came up with this, but the recipe we tend to give farmers is 80 pounds an acre of oats plus 50 pounds an acre of nitrogen. And if producers want to add in some peas, they could. So if they're adding in peas, 50% of the mixture by weight would be peas, and that will give a 2 to 4% increase in crude protein in that forage. So it's not as big of a increase in protein as many people think it will be, and peas can be expensive. So I always encourage producers to really pencil that out. What is the value of that 2 to 4% increase in protein versus other protein sources you could feed? So what is soybean meal like? What is canola meal like? Dried distillers grains with solubles, those kinds of things. Are you able to feed them? Do you have access to them? And what's that cost versus adding in the peas? Because sometimes it makes sense to have peas and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay, so Christine kind of gave the recipe there for oats, and oats have become, you know, very, very common as an annual forage. Lots of dairy farmers and others growing them, and there's been some good research that happened actually quite recently at the University of Guelph, also in partnership with some of our colleagues at OMAFRA, and this is just the title of the study. It was published just a few years back, and sometimes there's really great work that goes on at the university, and we just don't get the details out to growers enough. So I wanted to kind of pull out some of this information that came from this study. Before I do that, here's the background on it. So it was done at both the Elora and Woodstock Research Station in 2013 and 2014, and then, like I mentioned, there were some on-farm sites led by OMAFRA staff at 4 different locations, all in 2014. You can see the spring cereals were seeded mid to late August, and then actually at Elora and Woodstock they had a couple harvest dates, but at the on-farm trials they just had a single harvest. And so they looked at quite a number of different things with this study, and so I'm just going to quickly go through just kind of the highlights. First question is, you know, Christine talked about that 80 pound per acre rate for oats. You know, the question is, you know, is that the right rate, or could I increase production by having a bit of a higher rate? So they looked at that. They compared 80 kilograms per hectare to 120, and you can see there was no difference. They're the same tonnage, same yield off of both of them. And so, you know, in my work, what I found is really if you've got adequate fertility and you've got enough, you know, good growing conditions and enough time for that good growth to happen, you don't necessarily need to be going at an excessively high rate. You can get good tillering and good production that way. So 80 kilograms per hectare, 80 pounds per acre, you know, roughly in that ballpark is the recommended rate. So in this study, they looked at oats, but they also looked at barley and an oat pea mix. They looked at spring triticale in the first year as well, but had some issues and didn't follow that through. But here, out of 4 site years over 2 different seasons, these are the dry matter yields that they got from these different species, and you can see really no difference in, you know, yields are equivalent when you add peas in there, so you basically get the same yield. Barley in this case was disappointing, and that's because actually both years it was affected by septoria, so that really reduced productivity. But I know, Christine, maybe you can speak to this. You know, rust is a pretty common occurrence in oats, and so that's something to be aware of. They didn't observe it in this year. I don't know, Christine, do you want to talk just quickly about fungicide applications or scouting for rust?
Yeah, so another reason why they land, and I don't think Jake's got slides on this particular aspect, but one of the reasons the conclusion of that study was go with oats is because typically oats are cheaper than barley or spring triticale. And when that's the only, like, when that's one of the main considerations, that works great. But we do know that oats tend to be more susceptible to crown rust. So just the whole plant ends up orange. And while rusts don't produce any mycotoxins that could make livestock sick, they do steal nutrients out of the plant. They can reduce yields. And if the rust load gets really high, that can lead to coughing in livestock and feed refusals. So a little bit of rust, we're not worried about. Excessive rust, we are. So what people have been noticing is there's rust is endemic, and I think some rust may have overcome some of that older genetic resistance within some of those oat varieties. So we're seeing rust as a problem in some places in some years. And so sometimes it comes down to asking yourself, if I have a bad rust year, am I able and willing to spray a fungicide? Because for some producers, that's not an option. They don't have the equipment, or they're not willing to put the money into the fungicide as well. And in that case, sometimes barley or triticale is a better bet, because you might have a little less yield. I feel like this is an extreme difference. Usually when I see yield data, they're much closer. Oats, barley, and triticale tend to be a lot closer yield-wise than in this particular example. But yeah, if you're worried about rust and spraying is not on the cards, then probably barley or triticale, they tend to be a little more tolerant to rust, which is usually the big disease challenge on these spring cereal forages.
Thanks, Christine. And I just note as well that these yields are kind of 2 to 2.5 tons per hectare. Christine, in the kind of summary, or in the table that you provided earlier, the kind of yield range for spring cereals can be a fair bit higher than this.
I just want to go back and take a look, because I don't remember what was in that table. That was winter cereals, so 5 to 9.
You just had cereals in general here, and maybe that was more for winter cereal.
The high end is more for the winter cereals. The lower end would be more with your spring cereals. So yeah, 2.5 is what I would expect.
Okay.
For kind of a not headed out yet crop. So
perfect. Yeah, so that's what they found for yield. And then just to back up what Christine was talking about in terms of the bump in crude protein, here's what they found in terms of their oat to oat P comparison. And this was across 8 site years. And if you just take a decimal place off of this, so instead of 120, think 12%. That's really what we're looking at. So 12.8 compared to 15.3%. So that's where Christine was talking about that, 2 to 4% increase in crude protein that's borne out in this trial here. And I don't think they were quite 50-50, but they were close to that. I think it was 40-60 in terms of the amount of P's to oats for seeding rate.
All right, I promised we would talk about ryegrass. I have a lot of fun with this one. So when we talk about annual ryegrass in Ontario, there's actually 2 different ryegrasses that sort of fall under that nickname. One of them is Italian ryegrass. That's the one that's more common from your seed suppliers. The other is Westerwald ryegrasses. You can get it. There's less of it, but you can get it. So the difference between the two, Italian ryegrass, I like to explain it. It acts more like a winter cereal. It's not going to head out the year that you plant it. It has to go through that vernalization period, get cold over winter before it will start to set seed. In more temperate climates, milder climates, it's actually a short-lived perennial. So like in New Zealand or the British Isles, it'll last 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 on the outside. But for us in the past, it used to winter kill consistently. So that's why we consider it an annual. The Westerwald is a true annual. So it will try to set seed the year that you plant it. So if you have a spring seeded Westerwald, you've really got to manage that cutting schedule so that it doesn't head out and set seed, because you'll lose quality if it gets that mature. Both of these ryegrasses are hungry. They love nitrogen. Like ryegrasses, if they're in the ground for a full growing season, they'll use as much nitrogen as corn, but it's split applications. So about 50 to 70 pounds per cut, probably 50 is okay. So you take it off and apply your nitrogen, and that fuels the next round of growth. It is rocket fuel for ruminants. This is a grass that has so much sugar and so much digestible fiber because that's really what it's been bred for. And ruminants find ryegrass really, really palatable. It tastes great if you're a cow or a sheep. Um, so yeah, they love it. I'm hearing more and more, and Jake can probably confirm, a lot of crop producers that do not have livestock tend to be moving away from ryegrass as a cover crop. Jake, does that track? You're nodding?
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's the advice coming from University of Guelph and our
Yeah.
colleague, our weed specialist. Yeah.
And it's because ryegrasses are difficult to terminate for a few reasons. They have very waxy leaves, so that can make it a little harder for a herbicide to get in there and do its job. They've got an interesting metabolism, so they break down herbicide really well, so they're not necessarily as susceptible as some other species. And they've got a very flexible genome. So one of the first herbicide resistant populations that was identified in North America was an annual ryegrass. So yeah, they're a lot of fun for annual croppers to try to kill, and sometimes they're not expecting Italian ryegrass to actually come back with a vengeance because it's not an annual. But when it comes to feed, because it's such high quality, because it can have such high yield potential, ruminant producers tend to really like it because their livestock really like it. And I suspect some of how we manage it as a forage makes it easier to kill because I don't get complaints from livestock producers about trying to kill this stuff when they're done with it. So take that as you will. Let's see, what else have we got about this? So I stole this slide from Mike Cobra. He's our weed management specialist, and he was involved, along with some of the researchers at the University of Guelph, with some herbicide trials to try to figure out how to kill ryegrasses when you're done with them. So the best recipe they found before corn is the high rate of glyphosate plus some Ultim. But you got to make sure that if you're trying to burn this off, you're applying the herbicide when temperatures are at least 10 degrees Celsius and getting warmer, and the grass is less than a foot tall. If the grass is too big or the temperature's too cold, your herbicide is probably not going to be as effective as you would like, and really maximizing coverage is important. So he also suggests checking out sprayers101.com on how to set up all the equipment to make sure that your coverage is good. But yeah, so that's killing it, but I'm less worried about killing it in a livestock situation for a few reasons. One is that if you're taking a fall harvest, that's a stress on the crop. It's less likely to overwinter. If you're applying nitrogen to ryegrass, ryegrass is interesting about, it's kind of dopey about winter. If you keep feeding it nitrogen into the fall, it just keeps trucking. Like other grass species are going, oh, days are getting shorter, air is getting colder, maybe I'm going to harden off and get ready for winter. Ryegrass won't, it just keeps going. So I think partly because we're feeding it, we're cutting it, we are stressing it more, and that maybe is helping in when it comes time to terminate this crop, making it a little bit easier in those livestock situations. That coupled with if you've got something to feed those not quite perfect next crops to, you can erase a lot of sins that way. So yeah, I don't hear those same complaints from livestock producers about ryegrass, but it's something that we like to mention just so that nobody trying this for the first time gets in over their head and has a problem where it becomes a weed. So, Jake, did you want to touch on this one or do you want me to?
You go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, ryegrasses, you could seed them in the spring, so April or May, whenever the ground's fit to carry equipment. You could summer seed them in late August. Seeding rate is 30 to 40 pounds an acre. They're a fairly small seeded grass, so a quarter to half an inch seeding depth is plenty. And as I mentioned before, they're very hungry for nitrogen, so 50 pounds up front and 50 pounds after each cut. The waxy leaves mean they don't dry well for hay, but they make great silage or baleage. And yeah, variety selection can be important in terms of yield potential and overwintering potential and all of that. So yeah, that's ryegrasses in a nutshell. Okay. So
I just wanted interject there. I ran a bit of an experiment here. I guess it was 3 years ago, and I seeded ryegrass underseeded to alfalfa and timothy. And it was I have a friend, Carmen Courtney, who's in the seed business, and he had sort of suggested to me. In hindsight, I wouldn't do it again, but it was an interesting exercise. And we did take a cut for dry hay.
Did it dry?
It did.
Oh, good. Okay.
Perfect time of year. We had perfect conditions, basically.
Perfect.
On light sandy land. But yeah, it made a very poor companion crop.
Too aggressive or just not enough?
It wasn't competitive enough in my mind for the cover. We didn't seed heavy, and we ran into a few weed problems, which surprised me. I mean, the obvious choice was to use a spring cereal, oats or whatever, which was tradition for decades in this part of the world. And but it was still an interesting exercise.
Yeah, and I suppose depending on the spring you had too, because like with that sandy, I'm assuming it's fairly free draining soil.
Yes.
Yeah, ryegrass is thirsty. It loves water. It doesn't necessarily want to sit in water. So like a free draining soil is great, but if you're not getting rain like every 3 days, it starts to struggle. So that's what I mean when it's kind of hit and miss. Some people love it and have the right soil type and manage to get lucky with the rain often enough that it works great for them. And other people, it was worth trying once, and I can understand where you don't want to do it again.
Well, I just wanted to try something different.
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, it didn't work very well.
Fair enough. All right. So when people are talking about needing forage, particularly in the early spring before our perennials get up and going, winter cereals fill that niche really nicely. So that's the next group of crops we're going to talk about.
And I can take it from here.
It's your slide. I don't know what you wanted to say.
Yeah, perfect. And I
Oops.
think there we go. I'm just gonna, these are the ones we're gonna talk about really, and I'm gonna kind of similar to the last set, I'm gonna share a bit of data, kind of from a sister study to that spring cereal work that was done recently, and gonna look at how rye, triticale, wheat, and barley stack up against each other. But I think you've got one more here, Christine, that you want to speak to.
Yeah, so basically the green on this slide is just showing when those winter cereals are growing in comparison to our perennial crops. So we do get some fall growth. It's usually not enough to take a cut. So you could graze that, but it's not worth running equipment in the fall. But by the time we get into the spring, if you can put these winter cereals on some early ground, there's a chance to take a cut before we're ready for first cut on our perennials. So
perfect. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's basically a study done very close in timing to that work on spring cereals, and took a very similar approach, combining and a small plot research station trials as well as on-farm trials. And here are the authors. Here you can see Bill Dean, who's just relatively recently retired, was involved in both of these studies. So I showed you the dry matter yields for those spring cereals. Here you can see from the work they did looking at winter cereals, how they compare. So again, we were in that kind of 2 to 2.5 tons per hectare range for oats or oat pea mix. And you can see here for rye, triticale, two different varieties, and winter wheat, we're pretty well in that similar range when we're harvesting at the boot stage. So 2 to 2.5, maybe slightly higher for rye. If you want higher quality and you're going a bit earlier, of course, you're giving up a bit on yield. And if quality is not as important and you're more after the tonnage, then we are more in the range of possibly up to 4 or higher tons per hectare. So there's really not much separation amongst these different options. Cereal rye has a little bit of an advantage at that boot stage. You can see just a little bit more productivity. But it kind of flips when you look, if you were going and leaving it a bit longer to go with triticale instead. In terms of quality, again, this grams per kilogram. If you take 1 0 off the end, then you're dealing with percentages. So 10, 20, 30, 40%. And again, not a lot of separation amongst these different winter cereal options in terms of quality. You can see in the orange for crude protein, triticale is maybe just a hair higher, but really the fact that there's no letters there, that just means there's no statistical difference. So the only real difference there is that rye slightly higher ADF and slightly higher NDF, but otherwise not much to choose between in terms of quality. Again, when they're harvested at the same stage, the quality is really going to vary, as Christine already alluded to, depending on harvest. And I guess that's the one thing to note for winter cereals, because we have in recent memory had some pretty wet conditions in the spring and in the month of May, that quality is going to decline pretty rapidly if your harvest is delayed, right up until heading. So something to be aware of if you're thinking about a winter cereal as an option. It may not be as much of an issue if you're on, like you are, Ben. If you're farming lighter ground, you're probably not too worried about that in terms of getting on the field.
And I'll just add one more comment to that. We see this in studies with spring cereals and studies with winter cereals. The difference in quality between species is very small, to the point that with most growers, I say, pick your, make your decision based off of what agronomically fits in, like harvest timing kind of decisions rather than quality, because it's so small. The big differences in quality come with stage of maturity. So are you harvesting at flag leaf, at boot stage, at heading? That quality will decline fairly quickly. So that is a bigger difference in quality than if you're growing rye or triticale or oats or barley or wheat. Like the species within that, like winter cereals or spring cereals, species is very little difference. It's the stage of maturity that really affects quality.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Absolutely. And so then in terms of, if there's not much to choose between, then in terms of quality, then we've got to look at some of the other factors. So of course there's, seed cost considerations that we don't have directly here. We can chat about if you'd like. But to me, the big one in this kind of double crop system would be, when can you actually realistically get that crop harvested? And this is from 10 site years. So from all the on-farm trial locations, as well as the small plots over 2 seasons. And you can see here, this is just what we call a box and whisker. The X marks the average. So that average was about May 27th. The median date of boot stage and harvesting at boot stage was May 25th for cereal rye. And they got as early as May 23rd. When you look at winter triticale, on average, about June 3rd, and as late as June 12th in some at one location, and likely that would have been a spot that might have been seeded a bit later in the fall. Winter wheat, very similar to winter triticale. So their conclusion here out of this research is, the difference in harvest date is going to be, Christine, I think 7 to 10 days. You can look at these numbers, kind of show it. Is that
10 days to 2 weeks is what typically is out in extension material. Yeah.
Yeah. So pretty significant. If again, depending on location and your growing season, and what kind of window you have to deal with. Also, what crop you're going to be following with. To Christine's point, if you're following it with something like sorghum Sudan grass or something like a warm season grass like that, where really timely planting or really quick planting isn't as critical, maybe something like winter triticale is a better option. But if you're going, straight to corn or even to soybeans, having that extra 10 to 14 days is really going to be helpful for the next crop. And then the next question is, what's the right rate of nitrogen? And we've got general guidelines. I wanted to show this because this is, fairly recent work in Southwestern Ontario, kind of validating those rates and helping to give some assurance as to what that right rate might be. That's going to vary a little bit by the year. When this work was done, nitrogen didn't cost what it costs now. So bear that in mind. When we have higher nitrogen prices, we generally recommend you shift those rates down just a little bit. But here's what they found: that the optimal rate for cereal rye was about just over 40 kilograms per hectare, about 40 pounds per acre. This is just a generalized, this graph here showing the yield by nitrogen rate is generalized across the triticale, the rye, and the winter wheat. So, but I'm showing you what they calculated as the most economic rate for each species. So cereal rye came at just over 40. Winter triticale was just above at 50 kilograms per hectare. And winter wheat was higher at about 65, 67 kilograms per hectare for that optimal rate. At the end of the day, you know, if you're somewhere in that 50 to 70 pound per acre rate, that's likely going to be your most economic rate. And again, like we talk about with annual crops, it's not about getting the maximum yield, it's about getting the most economic yield. And again, especially with higher nitrogen prices, that gain for that extra little bit of yield when we apply higher rates, it isn't necessarily worth it. We want to target those modest rates there for these winter cereals.
And I guess this might be the time to point out, we don't often talk about winter wheat and winter barley for forage. Winter wheat, because by the time it's ready to harvest, it's sometimes a little too late. I know this trial, it was ready the same time as triticale, but some of those varieties are even later than triticale. And winter barley, I just don't have the data on because it's only been recently that we've got varieties that are overwintering much more consistently. So the data is just not there for winter barley. So
yeah, and to that point, Christine, they did evaluate winter barley, and I forget the variety in this trial, but they had issues with overwintering in the first year, and so they didn't end up having data on it. To your point,
yeah,
it's a nice crop option, early harvested small grain that I know some growers are having good success double cropping soybeans after, but yeah, maybe some new research needs to be done on newer varieties for forage for winter barley. Just to kind of sum it up in terms of, and I'm focusing on cereal rye here because it is probably the most popular option of the winter cereals. So for forage, you know, seeding rate 90 to 110 pounds per acre should be good, especially if you are hitting an earlier seeding date. So that optimum winter wheat seeding rate, seeding date is what we recommend if you're growing rye for forage. In my work that I've done with rye, looking at rye as a roll down cover crop and looking to get a thick stand, absolutely, the earlier you can get it seeded, the better and the more biomass you're going to get. So first half of September, ideally, if you can make that work, is going to make a big difference. If you are pushing seeding later into October, I'd recommend bumping that seeding rate up a little bit, you know, maybe more like 140 or 150. Absolutely needs to be drilled, and I just mentioned that seeding rate. Harvest timing is going to vary depending on the need, but you know, as a general rule, to balance quality and yield, the boot stage is a good bet. For cover crops, for general cover crop that's not going to be taken for feed, you know, we recommend anywhere from, you know, as low as could even be 15 to 20 pounds per acre, up to 60, could go 80 or 90 if you're really after some erosion protection or weed suppression. And that's got a really wide seeding range. Some growers even go into December. That's a little less predictable, but there's lots of different ways that can be established, and tends to be a pretty hardy cover crop. And then we've got a little bit of info for grain there that I won't go into right now.
Yeah. So terminating winter cereals tends to be easier than terminating ryegrass, thank goodness. Basically, there's kind of two general options. The first one is sort of your no-till, min-till option, herbicide burn down. So you're taking the crop off as your silage or baleage. You wait for some regrowth, because if you go in too early with the herbicide, there's nothing green for it to work on, so it won't be as effective. So make sure there's some regrowth there. And then you can no-till the crop right into that residue. The other option is full tillage. So if there was a situation where, you know, you've got an organic grower or someone that's not able or willing to spray, then aggressive tillage will kill that cereal crop. So whether it's a couple of passes with a heavy disc, whether you're flipping it right upside down with a moldboard plow, something aggressive to kill that crop. Then it comes down to trying to get a seed bed you can work with. So root balls can be an issue. Yeah, that seems to be the main challenge once we start tilling up a winter cereal after the fact. So just trying to work it so you can get a seed bed you can work with, and then putting the next crop in. So those are kind of the two options. there's some yeah, if you've got the herbicide in the mix, then you can play a bit on the tillage side, but root balls are always a concern, so min-till or no-till seems to be the way to go when herbicide is an option.
And I'm going to give an example just right now, showing some different kind of tillage options and a scenario here that I had back in 2017. So again, a wet spring, and this was corn silage ground that was seeded. It was drilled to a cereal rye cover crop that was seeded at 90. It was about 90 pounds per acre, so pretty decent rate, actually, right in that range of what a forage seeding rate would be. In this case, the grower was actually wanting to reduce erosion. He had a pretty long draw that was resulting in water erosion on this field. And again, with that bare soil after the corn silage harvest, he thought this would be a good option. I had some, you can see flags out there. I had it all flagged out because we were actually planning to do some termination timing trials before soybeans were planted with this rye cover crop. But what ended up happening was that it didn't stop raining. And you can see here out with one of our summer students, this was getting into early May, and this rye was just starting to take off and get to be to the point where it was again looking more like a forage crop than a cover crop, and getting to be fairly intimidating from a residue management standpoint for this grower. So what they ended up doing was he reached out to a neighbor, and they took that rye off for green feed. It was not at the ideal stage for it. Was probably close to heading, if not already headed out. But it really came down to him just wanting to get that material off the field so that he could get his crop planted. But he used that opportunity to try out a couple of different tillage systems. So most of the field was disked twice, and I stopped in on July 4th, and this is what the field looked like. And so completely reasonable looking soybean stand. Not out and ahead the neighbors, but again, it was a very, very wet spring, so everything was delayed that year. In terms of the option Christine just talked about, in terms of no tilling, and in my view, kind of the preferred option with this system, where you've really removed a lot of the above ground material, a lot of the residue. Not a difficult situation to no till into, and so he did have a number of strips that he just straight no tilled. And actually, he happened to have some strips that did not have the rye cover crop, and so you can see here where these beans were seeded, and actually there was a full growth stage difference where there was no rye cover crop. Just those beans were off to a faster start. And so just with some plant stand counts, and this is just to kind of reemphasize some of the points Christine was making, where that rye was disked twice. Those soybeans actually were off to a bit of a faster start, as we'd expect with worked ground for beans in the early season. The plant stand count was at about 111,000. Where it was no-till, actually there was a higher stand, and that was consistent across the variety of locations I measured at about 130. And so just again, I think that came down to the root balls just interfering with some of those seeds getting good seed to soil contact and coming through. And so, still an acceptable stand where it was worked, but certainly a better stand where it wasn't, and an even better stand where there was no rye at all. And that's consistent with the work I've done. We do have to consider that when we've got what would be considered a bit more adverse seeding conditions, when a forage crop has been taken off, or that we've got that plant material, those root balls there, that we're going to get a bit of a lower stand. But in terms of yield, at the end of the day, at this site, field average was 55, where he disked it twice. That was right on 55. And the no-tilled strips, there were two of them that were good length. They were 54. So in my view, really no different. Unfortunately, didn't have time to get the no rye taken off, but there is good information out there from the research on that. And generally, we actually don't see a negative yield impact in most cases when we're looking at soybeans following a harvested rye crop. Okay, so the next one is corn, and this is pretty common practice for growers who are growing a winter cereal like rye well, I should say specifically rye, because again, because the harvest date and being able to get out there earlier, that go to corn following that. And so here's just an example of a grower near the Munroe area in Oxford County who's been doing this practice for a number of years. Gord Green of Green Home Farms. So I'm just sharing kind of just to show the process that he goes through. And actually he just got back to me by text with to fill in some of the details that I'd forgotten, but he gets anaerobic digestate applied on that field after the rye's been harvested. So that'll go on. You can see in that photo, we've got organic amendment going on. And then he will go in and he uses strip tillage. And actually it's a somewhat common tillage method for growers following a rye harvested for feed. And you can see he's got liquid nitrogen going on with the strip tiller. He puts down about 80 pounds of nitrogen that is supplemented by, of course, the nitrogen that's in the digestate. And he then is planting that corn in those strips very, very quickly after making the strips based on his ground and not wanting it to dry out. And he's, again, putting some more nitrogen through the planter. And Gord's comment was that he actually applies 30 pounds per acre extra nitrogen from what his normal practice would be if there wasn't the rye ahead of time. And actually there's pretty good evidence, including some recent work out of Purdue, to show that yes, that can be beneficial in terms of helping to maintain that corn yield, and to compensate for the fact that rye has immobilized or taken up and you've removed some of that nitrogen from the soil system. So nitrogen management's a big one. I'll touch on that again in a moment. But here's what Gord's field looks like after he's planted. And again, this is not something he just started, in the last year or two. He's been doing this for a number of years now with quite good success. And the research there has been research done in Ontario on this system, this double crop system. It was done back in the 90s. And what they found actually was that it can hurt corn yields for sure. But spring tillage helped as opposed to no tilling into that stubble. So a spring strip till, for example, like this could help minimize the yield reduction. And when you consider the yield and revenue off of that forage crop, in addition to the corn crop, their research found that you're getting more productivity overall than if you didn't have the rye forage there at all.
Just to add on to that, there's some research out of New York State that Tom Kilser has done on double cropping your winter cereal forage and a silage corn crop. And they're pretty consistently getting overall forage yields that are higher than just the silage corn alone. So even though, yeah, you probably have to move to a slightly shorter season silage hybrid, in some cases it's very well worth it because you're getting more feed out of it than you could with just the full season silage corn.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And yeah, there are growers doing that as well in Ontario, silage corn following rye in this kind of setup. So I've alluded to it, and we really wanted to emphasize that there are some risks associated with this, and this risk is particularly associated with corn following rye, and that's because rye is an allelopathic plant. It releases allelochemicals that basically help to inhibit germination of weeds and also slow the growth of other plants, and that's why you can see, as I showed in the photo earlier, that it can be really good on fleabane and other weeds, lamb's quarters, pigweed. It's very effective against those, but that can also possibly have a negative effect on the corn plant. But there are other factors at play as well, and plant root disease is really believed to be the big one. So that green bridge, or that transfer of disease from one grass to another, is a concern. And then, considering how you're going to create a good seed bed, and also bearing in mind that rye can suck up quite a bit of moisture. And so if you're on lighter ground that's more susceptible to drought, or if you're entering a spring that's dry and setting up for a dry pattern, that's definitely something to bear in mind. And that's also a consideration as well for the tillage that's going to follow, and helping to preserve that soil moisture under those conditions. And I already alluded to nitrogen tie-up. Nitrogen management is also a big one, and Craig Drury from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is doing some really good research looking at nitrogen management following rye. Back to you, Christine.
All right. So the last kind of niche we can fill with these annual forage crops is that summer slump. And this is really where our warm season annuals shine. So particularly our sorghum species and our pearl millet. There are some other ones available, but these tend to be the most common, the most available, and the most consistently high yielding. Oh, my slide did not move. There we go. So as I've mentioned earlier, because we can get good sorghum yields in a much shorter window than it takes to grow, say, a corn silage crop, these warm season grasses can be a really great fit for a double crop situation. So for example, if our yellow is a silage corn crop, if we've got that off by late September, early October, put our winter cereal in the ground, so that's our dark green. We take that winter cereal off in May. We don't want to seed those warm season annual grasses until soil temperatures are consistently above 12 degrees. So they are much more sensitive to cold soils than corn is. So we really need to wait till that soil has warmed up. So often in most of Ontario, that's going to be the first couple of weeks of June. By the time we get in the north, that might be like third week of June before we get soil temperatures that are warm enough to put in these crops. But typically about 60 days till first cut, and we want to leave 6 inches of residue behind, 6 inches of stubble, to encourage that regrowth, and we'll probably get a second cut 30 to 45 days later. In, again, southern parts of the province, I know some growers that consistently get 3 cuts and then go in with their winter cereal to bring that double crop around again. But yeah, it kind of depends where you are and what the yield looks like. Once you get a frost, these grasses are done. So they're very frost sensitive, but they've got pretty high yield potential. So this 13 to 21, that's the full double crop. That's not just the sorghum Sudan grass. That's sorghum Sudan grass plus the winter cereal. So probably five-ish tons is coming from the winter cereal, and the rest is coming from the sorghum over a couple of cuts. Need energy supplement on here is basically just a comparison to silage corn. So if you were trying to swap silage corn out in a ration, this double crop system, you're getting a lot of tonnage, you're getting a lot of digestible fiber. None of these crops have the grain in it, right? Like we're in silane corn, while it's got a lot of starch, and it's the seeds are not mature, the kernels are not mature, but there's a lot of starch in there, and that's part of the energy in corn silage. With these other grasses, whether it's the winter cereals or the sorghums, we do not want them to head out. Forage quality tanks, and they just don't have the starch to bounce back the way corn does from that. So that's why this slide just says need an energy supplement, is if you were trying to do a swap from a corn silage ration. If you're not, depending on the class of livestock you're feeding, that may or may not be an issue. Jake mentioned allelopathy risks with fall rye. Sorghum has the potential to be allelopathic as well, whether this is our forage sorghums, our Sudan grasses, or the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids. But it seems to only be at very high seeding rates. So most commonly we're seeding these kind of between 30 to 40 pounds an acre, but a lot of producers that really want fine stems, digestible stems, reduce the lignin, they've been pushing the seeding rate recently. I really get nervous around 60 pounds an acre. I did have a call a couple years ago, and we're pretty sure that the alfalfa they seeded afterwards may have failed because of allelopathy from the sorghum. So yeah, if we keep that seeding rate a little more moderate, then we're staying away from some of those lodging problems, and we still get a good crop with fairly fine stems that is palatable and digestible. So yeah, don't jack up the seeding rate too high on those sorghums. So this slide is just kind of summarizing our agronomy differences. I mean, we've already talked about the dark green stuff, our fall rye, our winter triticale. We haven't really talked about hybrid rye, but I think the notable thing there compared to open pollinated is just that there seems to be higher yield potential in those hybrid rye varieties. But when it comes to our sorghums, soil temperature is critical. There's a lot of literature on seeding rates for forage sorghum that is actually based on target populations, which I think is the direction we need to move in, because seed size can vary so much for sorghum species, even within a single variety. There can be huge variability in seed size. So if we're seeding on a weight basis, that can have huge impacts on our population. So, like I said, when we get up to 60 pounds, I get nervous because of allelopathy potential. But even at 40 pounds, if we have very, very small seeds, we could have really high plant populations. So, because of that variability, it would be nice to move more to a target plant population. There's good literature, good data out there on what that should be for the forage sorghums. But for sorghum, sudan grass, and sudan grass, there's really not the same level of consensus. We know that those sudan grass as a species and sorghum sudan grass as a hybrid, they can go much higher seeding rates than the forage sorghums, but I couldn't find consensus on what that should be. So that's an area where we do need more research. Seeding depth, again, it's a pretty small seeded crop, so 3/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch depth. And again, it's a big grass, so for nitrogen, we're looking at somewhere between 90 and 110 pounds up front, and then 50 pounds after first cut to feed your second. If you're in a situation where you're taking a third, you want another 50 pounds after second. So basically, we need that 50 pounds to feed the regrowth. Forage sorghums are typically a one-cut crop, but the other ones, 4 to 6 inches of stubble for regrowth, or sorry, 4 to 7 inches, just to make sure they've got something to grow from. They're not as tolerant of low, tight cutting as our cool season crops are.
Christine,
Yeah.
so we go on depth, but is there a recommended row width? Like, is 7.5 inch? Good. Like, what would you like to see?
Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive into recommended row widths, and it's not something that I worry about as much, and I think that's just because we're not harvesting it with a header, like we're mowing this, right? So how wide are your rows? Yes, that may impact yield. Like I said, I haven't done a deep dive, so I couldn't tell you for sure, but it's not a question I get asked often because everyone's going, okay, well, what's the drill set at? And if it's really wide, then either you're, if you've got the GPS, you can just shift over. And if you don't have the GPS, then you're probably cross seeding and traveling across the field like half the rate one direction and then half the rate the other direction, to try to just get that crop canopy to close faster. So I don't have row width information for you. Sorry. Okay. I do want to highlight that when we're integrating our annual forages, particularly into grain crop systems or other annual cropping scenarios, both taking it as stored forage and grazing can be good options from a soil health perspective, but they're not the same option. They're good in different ways and they need different considerations. So I want to quickly run through that just for awareness, really. So if we're taking baleage or silage and we're bringing the manure back, because we're running all that equipment, several passes to get the crop off and another pass to get the manure back, it costs a lot. On the flip side, the grazing, if we're putting temporary fence around a field next door and, we need to get power to it, we need to get water to the livestock, but usually all of that's pretty low cost. The kicker is that field accessible? If it's down the road, there may not be handling facilities. It gets complicated. Not every field is accessible to make a grazing scenario work. So there's the cost piece, but not every field is suitable for both of these options. When we start talking about soil compaction, our colleagues have done a lot of great work. So Ian McDonald and Alex Berry at OMAFRA have been doing a lot of work on soil compaction from farm equipment, all kinds of farm equipment. And consistently what we're seeing, they'll stick sensors in at like 8 inches, 12 inches, and 20 inches depths, and they'll run all kinds of equipment over it. And we can see the pressure down, almost 2 feet deep in the soil profile. It's the tires matter to reduce compaction, and axle weight matters to reduce compaction, but there's a lot of squish happening at depth in that soil profile. When we get compaction from livestock, it tends to be very shallow. And what this means is, while Ian and Alex's equipment compaction work has shown that things like frost going in and out of the ground and roots and all of these things that we were historically told would help with compaction don't work on equipment compaction, they do work on livestock cause compaction because it's shallow. It's in the root zone. It's in that top, 2 inches where the frost is going in and out. So there's a lot more ability for soils to recover from mild to moderate livestock compaction. And when we talk about grazing cover crops, every farmer I've talked to was like, I was a little worried about it, but decided to graze anyway, and it wasn't even a concern. Like, I don't know why I was worried. And I've heard that over and over and over again, having that conversation for the last 4 years. So very different types of soil compaction when it happens, and very different solutions for preventing it and for fixing it if it does happen. When it comes to nutrient cycling and soil fertility, with the baleage plus manure application system, obviously those nutrients only come back if the manure is returned or if some fertilizer is applied. There's an extra step there to make sure that that happens. Grazing, ruminants will take 20% of the nutrients that they eat, and they kick the other 80% out the back end. So it's a much slower decline in soil fertility over time. There's not a pro or con here. It's just a different system and a different dynamic to be aware of there. And the last difference between these two systems is that animal impact is a part of grazing. So it's kind of a vague term that sort of encompasses, there's fresh manure going down on the ground that has living bacteria in it that's interacting with the soil. And there's animals that are, ripping leaves instead of cutting them very neatly. And there's saliva involved in that. And plants are responding to those sorts of things. And even the tugging pressure during the bite can stimulate plants in different ways that the equipment doesn't. So while we don't necessarily have the complete understanding of the soil microbiology to know what's happening here, grazing managers will tell you about animal impact, and they can see differences in landscapes that have been grazed versus not grazed. And we've seen, varieties of perennial forages that come to market that are marketed as pasture varieties, but they were selected under mowing regimes, like intense mowing, as simulated grazing, and then they flop in the pasture because they don't handle animals as well as they handle a mower. So we know it's real. We can't totally explain it. It is a difference between these systems, but again, there's not this isn't a good versus bad. This isn't a one is better than the other. It's just they work on the landscape in different ways. So finding whether a stored forage system versus a grazing system fits each individual field is something that bears thinking about.
Okay, we're nearing the end of our slides here, and I wanted to address the question of whether harvesting cover crops reduces their soil benefits. I know we're talking these in the context of their annual forages, which really is, I think, the proper way to think about them. But from a cash cropper perspective, they're thinking about all these species as cover crops, and in a lot of cases looking to retain the above ground material for their soil health objectives, or for weed suppression or whatever it might be. And so, Ben, your farm on lighter ground and where it's largely cash crops, you got a bit of hay, and you're thinking about integrating annual forages. I think this is maybe something useful to think about in your scenario, or for any cash crop grower who might be thinking about, who might have a livestock neighbor approach them to harvest a cover crop for feed. This is kind of what the research says on this question, which is basically that harvesting cover crops has little effect, or in some cases no effect at all, on soil properties compared to having a cover crop and not harvesting it. So the one effect there is there's going to be less soil organic matter going back into the soil because you are removing a portion of it, the above ground material. But it's important to note that roots make a greater contribution to soil organic matter, stable soil organic matter, than above ground material does. So by leaving those roots in place, you are still making a positive contribution that plant material, that plant that was actively growing, it was fixing carbon dioxide and helping to turn it into forms that are going to do some beneficial things in your soil. The one thing that's been noted is in a couple of different studies is that water infiltration can be reduced compared to having a regular cover crop. You know, like say an oat cover crop that gets frosted off and it's left on the soil. You've got lots of kind of mulch and organic material that helps slow down the water and help it infiltrate quicker compared to taking that material off for feed. So that's something to bear in mind. You know, if you are on a soil that's prone to water erosion, you know, making sure that there's enough soil cover on there is going to be important. And then finally, Christine has already alluded to this. You know, consider the fact that you are removing nutrients, and in particular P and K. You know, there's no free lunch, and in this case, you know, we're still doing lots of good for the soil, but we need to be cognizant of replacing those nutrients that are being taken off. Christine, you want to speak to this, or do you want me to?
Sure. So yeah, one thing that we wanted to share with you guys is that the Midwest Cover Crop Council has a cover crop decision tool. So the idea is you put in that you're in Ontario and what county that you're in, and you pick some goals for your cover crop. So I really like this one because they have both mechanical forage harvest and good grazing as separate goals. There is another cover crop calculator that is similar, that is for like Ontario and the eastern Canadian provinces. It's got the same Ontario data set in it, but I think they only have forage value as a goal. So if you're thinking about harvesting, that's fine. It doesn't necessarily have the nuance that some of these cover crops are good to graze but don't store well. So I like this one because it does include that nuance. So basically, then you add in, you know, what cash crops you're growing. You talk a little bit about the drainage in your field, and it will spit out based on, you know, rough planting and harvest dates, which cover crops are going to help you meet those goals. And kind of when you would need to seed them, and you can sort of look at how they're going to fit in that crop rotation. They've got like a dozen goals in there. Those are just the two that I've shown you are the two forage related ones, but they've got things like nitrogen scavenger or soil builder or erosion prevention or weed control. So they've got all the like cover crop kind of goals in there too. So I think you can select up to 3, and it sort of filters and ranks them based on how well that crop will help you meet that soil health goal. So this is kind of what it looks like once you've selected your goals. And so it ranks like, I'm not sure why alfalfa is in here as a cover crop because it's a perennial, but okay. So alfalfa is excellent for both grazing and stored forage. And so they say, you know, reliable establishment in my part of the province. So Kawartha Lake's kind of between middle of April and early June, and then maybe not a great time to try establishing it in the heat of summer, but then by the time we get into August, it's a lot more reliable to establish. So that's kind of what it's showing here, and it just ranks a whole bunch of different ones. And if you click on the names of the crops, you get some fact sheets with more information about, you know, seeding rates and things to think about and what they're good at and what they're not good at and all of that. So yeah, Midwest Cover Crop Council selector tool is helpful for wading through all of the options because there's a lot of options.
And just a quick note on that tool was completely revamped within the last 12 months or so with a group of people from Ontario with support from some other Midwest states, and so yeah, we've been really fortunate, and largely because of our colleague Amber Holland, who's been involved with this group for years now, to be part of this network. And so yeah, this is up-to-date information. It's a lot of it's based on research, and some of it's based on like experience from experts. And so yeah, I'd second that it's a great place to go to look for information. And just to wrap it up, we wanted to share a couple of other resources related to this topic. So first off, we've got a blog called Field Crop News. If you're not aware of it, we post timely information on there. There's always articles on different field crop related topics on there, but also on you know, forage and grazing topics as well. We've got a Field Crop News YouTube channel as well, and I'd mentioned the cover crop grazing events that we've done over the years, and we've got webinars posted. That's just one example, but there's actually a few of them on there. And we also have had different cover crop webinars in the past, including one that was specifically on making forage. And then Christine, maybe I'll let you speak to your own publication that's coming soon.
Yeah, so project that's been keeping me busy is we've been updating, revamping, collating our forage resources into a shiny new guide to forage production. So the last edition of this is 1994. I promise it has changed a ton. So I don't have an exact date when it's coming out, but I think if things continue on track, hopefully fall, we will have this available. But yeah, I'm excited for it to be released because I've been referencing notes on like seeding rates, dates, depths in the draft for a couple of years now, and I'm excited for other people to be able to look those things up too. So yeah, hopefully fall that will be coming.
And that's all we've got for slides. So we're just past 8:30. But Laurie, happy to take some questions or wrap it up. Completely up to what you guys want. Thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.
I imagine that there are some questions. Fire away if you have questions for Jake or Christine.
Ben here, just a couple of comments. First of all, thanks to Christine and Jake, much appreciated. And Laurie, thanks to you for everything you do, and that's a lot of things in this community, I know that. This whole vision, the idea of double cropping, I can never understand why we didn't do more of this in the province. Back in the 70s, I was aware of a family down in the Ridgetown area that ran a cropping system of winter barley and then corn silage on 100 very rolly, very light acres, and they fed finished between 500 and 600 head of cattle a year. And I was just fascinated with this system. And all the manure from the cattle herd went back on that land. And they had done this for a good part of a generation. And I came to this part of the world when I first moved up here, and I saw, large pasture farms, no cross fencing, and low cattle rates. And of course, those were the glory days of the beef business. I thought, man, this is just grossly underutilized. But now I yearn for those days because you don't see any fences, and it's all soybeans.
We wanted more fence, not less.
Yeah, it's all soybeans and it was a struggle with my nephew getting him out of what I call that corn soybean mentality. And I am very unhappy with the way cropping practices have gone in this province, and what I call the overuse of soybeans, and particularly how it has affected organic soil matter. And it's a very short-sighted crop rotation, I call it. And but we're seeing a turn in this area. One of the larger, young, really aggressive cash croppers in this area grew 1,200 acres of hay last year as part of his rotation, and built a building, a significant building, 400 plus feet long, to store it. And he markets
I know who you're talking about, I think.
Yeah, it's Craig Tralford. And
Okay. I haven't met him yet. That's exciting.
No, that's not who I thought. I was thinking of someone else who's also added hay to their rotation, but yeah.
So there is changes going on. One of the things a couple of large cash croppers in this area use oats after winter wheat, but they burn it off. It's just becoming this beautiful crop, and then they burn it off. And for the life of me, I can't understand why they do that.
I mean, it usually winter kills, so I'm confused too. Although we did hear some stories this past winter where some oats in like the deep south did not winter kill, and everyone went, "Oh no!"
I think I would guess they're maybe looking to manage some perennial wheat pressure or winter annuals. I know that's becoming, even with people who are really enthusiastic about not spraying their cover crops in the winter, are starting to give kind of second thought to that because of some weeds that are, when they're not controlled in the fall, are causing them issues the next season. That's maybe a bit generous of me. Maybe that's not the reason why, but that could be a reason why.
I've never received a good explanation. My nephew works for one of these gentlemen, and very progressive, and you know, there's an on-staff agronomist. This is quite an enterprise, and but it's their practice to do this. And I just, for the love of me, I can't understand why. Have I got anything else here? Just one thing, we talk about oats, but you don't mention forage oats. You know, not all oat plants are created equally in my mind. I used to grow seed oats years ago for W. Thompson, and but I'd like to know a little more about forage oats, and are there good varieties out there available?
So we don't have any third-party variety testing on the forage side.
Okay.
There are forage varieties. The main difference, as I understand it, is they have much better regrowth than a grain variety. So I don't even know if they're yielding higher, but it's that regrowth. So like your odds of getting a second cut off a forage oat. So like if you plant them in the spring and you take a cut, they'll come back. Whereas if you use grain oats for silage, you plant them in the spring, you take a cut, they'll come back slowly. If you're patient and the weather's just right, you could get a second cut. Whereas the forage varieties, you will get a second cut. Unless, you know, really bad weather strikes. So that is, to my mind, the main difference. I don't know if there are differences in rust susceptibility. That's one question I haven't got an answer to yet. But again, it's partly because we have a less available data on that because we don't have third-party forage variety trials, and the cereal crops committee is focused on the grain, so they're not testing for those forage traits specifically. So we just don't have.
I haven't bought oat seed in a long time, but they are identified separately as a forage oat. If you look at the varieties.
Yes, you can get forage oat varieties, but you're probably going to be talking to forage seed companies rather than companies that specialize in grain may carry some, but I haven't actually talked to them. But I know the forage companies, they'll often have forage oat varieties in their portfolios.
Just Christine, for you, you're the forage and pasture specialist. What is your area? You're working out of the Kawarthas, obviously, and
I cover the whole province.
I wondered that. And I suspect
it's very big.
I suspect very true.
It's very big. It's fun, but it's very big. Yeah, so I cover the whole province. This probably kind of came through my background. My training is more on the grazing side, but obviously stored forage is so important with our climate. Grazing year round is a fun challenge to work towards, but is probably not practical in most places most years. We need stored forage at least as a backup, and obviously like our dairy sectors are indoors, they're feeding stored forage year round. That's fine. So I do both. My background is more on the grazing side, but we did try to steer this more to the stored forage piece because that tends to be where managing annual forages sort of fits, is very often on the stored forage piece.